over there. There we go. We've got the bathrooms over there, for those of you who don't know. And of course, in the unlikely event of a fire, the doors are right over there to my left. It is my great pleasure to speak at this event, actually, which you'll find out shortly why it's especially special for me. But I wanted to thank you all for coming this evening as well. Obviously, you have an interest in peace building, peacekeeping. Perhaps you want to work in that field one day, or you already do, or you're working in the field of international development, and this might be an avenue you'd like to pursue and learn more about. The term peacebuilding covers activities by the UN, other international organisations, or community groups and individuals that aim to prevent or resolve conflict. The transition from armed violence to lasting peace is neither easy nor the aim of all parties, and women's experiences of the journey to peace are often quite specific. The establishment of self-sustaining peace encompasses more than just an absence of violence. It takes complementary and mutually reinforcing efforts from political, legal, economic, social, and security institutions. Consequently, peacebuilding also involves working to restore trust within and between nations, reconstructing institutions, and most importantly, civilian-led humanitarian responses to and protection of people forcibly displaced by conflict and disaster. The Australian NGO sector has been actively involved in protection of displaced communities and in peacebuilding activities with roles including mediation, conflict and dispute resolution, academia, monitoring and evaluation, communication and policy. Which leads me to introduce our speaker this evening, Jennifer Scott. The reason that it's especially special for me to introduce Jennifer is because she is my aunt. So we have a very strong family connection, and Jennifer is, in fact, my inspiration personally for entering the field of development and doing my Masters in Peace and Conflict Studies, looking up to Jennifer my whole life. So I'm very happy to introduce her. She is a lawyer and a mediator focusing on environmental law, ecological sustainability and conflict resolution. She has an LLM specialising in environmental law and a Masters of Dispute Resolution with Peace and Conflict Studies. And I do recall asking you specifically, should I do human rights or peace and conflict? And you said very clearly, peace and conflict studies, that's the one. Jennifer has been the world trainer for Rotary International, and she's taught people from over 160 countries about peace, mediation, arbitration, and resolving disputes. And she's worked extensively with peacebuilding as a representative at Kyoto Peace Cadre for Rotary International. She has a very impressive bio, so I'm not going to read the whole thing because we'd be here all night with all the things that Jennifer has done in her extensive career and very busy life. She's supposedly retired, but yet she seems busier than ever. So I'd like to, firstly, I guess, let's hand over to Jennifer to further introduce herself and tell us a bit more about her work. And I've got quite a few questions here to kick off with, but I'll pass the chair to Jennifer.
Thank you, Will. That's better. Well, I'm going to tell you a story. It's going to start with a quote. A friend of mine actually gave me this quote. You know how sometimes out of the mouths of somebody comes something that is a gem. So take note. In order to live in the society you want, you have to be prepared to build it. And that's what we are doing. And if you don't complain. It is our responsibility. So how did I become a peace builder? I was going to say it takes a lifetime journey, but it actually started before I was born, when I come to think of it. My father was born in Egypt. Italian mother, British mixed father, you know what generations in countries can be. And my mother's from Northern Ireland. And the 1950s and 40s, post-war Egypt was nationalisation and a lot of killing, wanting to get rid of the British, and it was a dangerous place. So Dad left and sought a more peaceful country, Australia. My mother from Northern Ireland was a bit of a rebel. She was different. You know, I think I'm conservative. I think we're both conservative compared to my mum. Anyway, my grandfather thought that Northern Ireland was not really a safe place for my mother. So at age 19, he brought the family to Australia for a more peaceful life. So escaping conflict and coming here. And I think we have a country where many, many in our population have done that. So what made me think of peace? Well, probably naivety to begin with. I don't know about you, but when I was about 5 or 6, I decided I was going to save the world. I haven't succeeded, and I realised one doesn't. You just help build peace. Then I was going to become Prime Minister, and you may have noticed that I haven't done that either.
Not yet, not yet.
Though I was involved in politics for many, many years. But as I grew up, and we both are people who think of rights and justice and things, so of course it was natural I'd become a lawyer. But not just any lawyer. I was the first year going through Macquarie University, and that law school was focused on justice and peace. So while other law students from other universities at that time, so if any are lawyers in the room, this is a place and time in the 80s and late 70s, the other law schools would talk about their billable hours they were going to make, their dollars. We would talk about what difference we could make. So we were grounded in that thinking. Then I met my husband, a young, dashing flying officer in the RAAF. And it was April 1975. Vietnam had fallen, and there were thousands and thousands of mixed race babies being abandoned in South Vietnam. Probably a lot of you won't remember that. So the Air Force flew in, my husband flew C-130 Hercules to rescue the babies. And the Americans did it as well. And mothers were abandoning their babies because the mothers knew they would die because they were seen to have been with the wrong side and the babies were of mixed colour. So the only way to rescue these babies was to put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cardboard boxes in a plane and fly them to Thailand and then to fly them to Sydney. And the old quarantine station at Manly was reopened to house the babies, and there were lots of volunteer nurses caring for them until we could work out what to do. Some of those babies didn't survive. Ian went backwards and forwards with boxes of babies. And that's when you work out war, the impact on war on the most innocent. These babies didn't choose to have American fathers, Australian fathers. These babies didn't choose the war. Most of their mothers would have been killed. They're Australian citizens. None of them, if you've gone to a Sikh family, but it's nearly 50 years ago. But from intellectually talking about peace and war, it became real. So I continued in my law and just by luck ended up in environmental law. It can be luck sometimes, you answer an ad. And then I got a phone call from Robert Hill, the Minister for the Environment and the Leader of the Government of the Senate, 1996. And he said, I'm looking for an environmental lawyer to be my advisor on climate change. And I thought, I don't know a lot about it, but I'll find out. And then I got involved in the Kyoto Protocol and that area, which is peace building. Now, I know people, you see people arguing about how disappointed they are with the outcomes of some of these climate negotiations. Well, trust me, to see any agreement when you have 160 to 190 nation states negotiating is fabulous. Because we've moved from here to there. Our aim may be here, but we have moved. Of course, implementation is another aspect. I was very much involved in politics for many years of my life. And then I got involved in Rotary International. Now, the reason for that switch was politics. Yes, I was proud of the work I did, but you have to spend so much time to do so little good because politics is so much about protecting your own back. In Rotary International, you can spend all your time and you see all the good. and the difference. So why Rotary? I'd been involved in as a high school student. And it was one of the areas that, as a lawyer in my community where I used to live in the Hawkesbury, I was the only lawyer not in Rotary because I was a woman. And at that time, women weren't allowed to join. But it took a Supreme Court case in the United States where a group of men in a Rotary club took it all the way to not only the Supreme Court, but the Court of Appeal in America to win the case. Because it was a business and professional organisation, therefore should have nothing to do with gender. And of course, women are in Rotary. So I'm going to fast forward. In my club, we called them at that time Romeos, and I spoke to somebody earlier, Romeo is an acronym. The acronym is Rotary Old Men Eating Out. And that's a bit what it was like when I joined. But they were good old blokes. But my passion was bigger than the local community. And it was around 2010, I was at a Bangkok convention and I'd heard about sustainable Cambodia. And I thought, look, it's a cheap holiday. I'll go and have a look. And that turned my thinking totally into what can be done. And it turned my thinking about peace. I'd already changed from litigator to mediator. And I changed from that stream, even though, because as a commercial environmental lawyer, you know, we would argue cases, loved winning, loved going in for the kill as a litigator. And I would win my cases. And one day I said to my client, we won. And he looked at me and said, that was dreadful. That was horrific. You destroyed the other side. All I wanted to do was win the case. So I had to think of a better way of doing things. And it was just by luck I got into mediation. And at that time, mediation was known as basically a process in search of a theory. In that we did it, but we really didn't appreciate the impact. We just did A, B, C, D, and like magic, it worked. And then we began to explore the why. And then we began to understand that mediation's all very well, but you're dealing with the end product, the dispute. So in our mediation circle, we began to say, well, what if we started managing relationships, conflict avoidance, conflict resilience, so there was fewer mediations? And that's how we got into that space. So back to sustainable Cambodia. Some people describe peace as the absence of war. But I describe peace as the absence of want. You see, imagine a world. I mean, how can you have peace if you're in fear of your life, you're hungry, you can't get clean water, you can't go to the toilet during the day if you're a girl in Cambodia, unless there's a toilet. So you can only go in the forest or in the fields at night, where there's unexploded ordnances, where I didn't know that cobras were night animals. So the danger. So how can you have peace when you live in a world where there is so much want? So the work I do is practical peace. We go into communities, do community assessments, find out need, and partner with those communities. And I've been doing that within Cambodia for many years with other groups. Starts off small, and now we've got a few hundred people involved. And you do village by village. And we started off with schools, but that didn't work because of malnourishment. We then had to go to water, sanitation, and then education. So we've covered several thousand, well, about 50 villages of about 2,000 to 3,000 people per village. We now, from no education at all in 2003, we have nearly 400 university graduates. So the difference is making, and they are the future of Cambodia. We could rail against the government there and we'll be kicked out as an NGO. So everybody misses out. So we work with what we've got. And it's coincidental when you find these places. 2017, a friend of mine came back from Mongolia where her brother was doing a documentary on the head lama there. And the head lama said, "Can you help us?" These men from Erdenet had come to see him and they were lost. They needed help. So she came back and I set up what's called a vocational training team of mediators, psychologists. We went over and did a community assessment. We do that first because we don't know what the need is. Anybody been to Mongolia? This small country, squashed, sandwiched between Russia and China. Unique because they are themselves. They're a proud nation. They loved their Genghis Khan. For centuries, they were Buddhist, and the lamas, priests, managed their lives and it worked. 1930s, Russia came in. Very different to the rest of the world. Russia took the women to be educated. The men remained on the farms uneducated for the meat and the milk. 1990s, democracy, generations of educated women, generations of uneducated men. And then the men lost their farms because of mining. So they turned to drink and violence. So we were called in to create a process of managing the conflict and helping them through this changed environment of so different, all these educated women and all these men who had lost their self-esteem. And from that, we work through Family Law Act, family mediation. The Mongolians were out here just a few months ago looking at now setting up relationship centres like we have in Australia, family law like Australia. So from that one project that took over a few years and the Mongolians so involved and passionate about it, it's changing the law in that country. That's practical peace. It doesn't happen overnight, but it happens. And then, of course, in Nepal, the work we do there. But what about, I'd leave it at that.
There's so much to unpack there, but it actually leads to a few really interesting questions. And, you mentioned talking about, changing laws in these countries and practical peace, or, changing from a state of negative peace to a state of positive peace. So for those of you who might have studied peace and conflict studies, that's something that we talk about a lot. So it might be the absence of war, but as you said, there is the need is still there. So you're in a state of negative peace. Do you think that the notion of responsibility to protect is effective? And this kind of leads to that question about Mongolia in particular. Do you think it has sort of colonial and patriarchal undertones? So looking at a country that might have a strong patriarchal, Cambodia is another one as well. I know from my own experience there. And so when you're working in these communities that have very strong patriarchal overtones, how do you manage that in those arbitration and mediation circles, particularly when there is, these countries experience a lot of violence. Cambodia in particular is a post-conflict zone, suffering decades of intergenerational trauma. Leading to periodic displays of violence, particularly in families, which again is a state of severe negative peace. So how do you manage some of the work that you do in dealing with the patriarchal overtones and protecting women and communities?
Well, firstly, we make sure it's not us, the Westerners, doing it. It is they must empower themselves. We started off this concept of let us do it for you. And it was actually one of the local lovely men who was helping us out just said, but you can't do it for us. We have to do it for ourselves with your assistance, with funding and everything. So we have men and women as community liaison officers, Cambodians, and they go out and they create village committees. And on those village committees, we insist on having women. And if the village chief won't allow it, they will create a separate committee. So I was in one of those meetings and the men were going on and on and on. And this fabulous old lady stood up and started yelling. And I said, stop, I want to hear what she's saying. And she was saying, we want toilets, latrines. We want toilets. So after that meeting, I gathered all the women together. And it's really hard. Where do you start the conversation? I started with saying, I'm a grandmother. Are there any grandmothers here? And we talked about children they've lost, because you're lucky if your kids get beyond 5 in some of these communities, how they survived and why they wanted toilets. So it is making sure they have a voice. But the other aspect is making sure we educate girls, because once a girl is educated and earns money, she's valuable. And once a girl is valuable, they're less likely to be abused. That sounds dreadful, but it's a reality. And also the women, even if it's basic, well, we started with basic sewing and now their skills have improved, they become valuable. So that's how we deal with it on the ground in Cambodia. In Nepal, it is horrific. Working on the border there and seeing, so we have, there's an organisation that have volunteered women who have post-abuse, who are on the border watching the eyes of the girls and calling out, do you need help? I can get you help. Come with me now. It's a dreadful situation. So in Nepal, there's a lot of poverty and the children just disappear off the street. So we will, if there's mothers or sometimes fathers who are so worried because they've become ill and they can't manage the children, we support a halfway house where the girls can come and be protected and educated. Because, well, there was one father that came to us and we looked after this girl from age 8 through to 21, right through to her training, because her mum was a madam. And so the mother was coming back because Sidixia was 8, old enough to be trafficked. Yeah. And this happens so much, that border with India. And there's amazing organisations and very brave women that work the borders to grab other women who and young girls. It's very bad there.
Nepal is a big destination for sex trafficking to India and to Russia. So there's a lot of great organisations doing work there, but it is a particularly difficult location, particularly on those borders. I would like to ask, have you ever encountered, and can you give examples of challenges or instances of sexism in your peace building work? So for example, you've mentioned some really interesting male leaders who have come to you and asked you for help, but have you had the opposite where they've been unwilling to engage with you because you are a woman?
Yes, I have, and quite understandably. So the men in Erdenet that sought help from the Lama, they were disempowered men. And all these men were raising children by themselves, either because their wives, educated, had left home, gone to work in Hong Kong, or their wives had died. There was one man who was in his 20s. He had a 3-month-old. His wife died of breast cancer, and he had 2 others under 5, and the mother-in-law was trying to take away. So I have to say, perhaps it's a twist to your question. They wouldn't open up while I was in the room, or 3 other females. We are psychologists. And they just had their head down. And we had one male mediator from Australia, Lawrence Boyer, professor, fabulous man. And he came to the back of this and he said, look, perhaps the women should leave. And we did. And so there's 2 Mongolians and Lawrence. And those men not only opened up, they found solutions. So this is 2019, they were doing that work. They are working today in forming support groups. But I realised that, yes, as a woman, it just didn't work. In other countries, it just depends on how they see you in the hierarchy. I have to say, it's often in first world countries still that I see where I might be there with my husband and they'll go up and presume he's the expert and not me. And they just talk to him.
I mean, he's very impressive, but he's not the expert in peace building. Do you have an example that you know of, certainly from your work, and also the work of your husband, Ian, of a post-conflict state that created post-conflict peace? And do you think that this country was particularly successful in building peace? I think it's a pretty tricky question because I can't think of any personally.
Again, peace is not an outcome, it's a journey. I mean, look at our own country. We are a relatively peaceful country, but there's times where there is conflict and no peace. So you look at it are some of the countries becoming more peaceable? Let's look at it that way. Certainly Mongolia, yes it is. With all the issues they've had and the fact that they've now begun to understand that you can get divorced, you can both co-parent, and that men and women should be valued. So I think that has moved on. It's still a long way. Cambodia's become more wealthy. Has that wealth spread? Certainly in the work that we do in Pursat, it's over the years. So when there's a need, we don't bring it over from Australia. So we don't bring bicycles over. You see these people who take bicycles and computers and all those things to help. That's not helping. We might give them the funds and they'll buy them locally. So then you've got a small business person fixing up bicycles, repairing bicycles, fixing up computers. So that is developing in the area we work at, yes, and in the areas like in Siem Reap in the hospitality industry and the hospitality school we support there, that these young people are the breadwinners, and it's better for them because that generation aren't in abject poverty anymore. It's a slow process. Ask me that question in 40 years' time and we'll have another review on what these countries are like.
Yeah. Well, that actually leads me to my next question, and I'm pretty sure you've already answered this in many ways, but is peace building ever a linear process, or is it always messy and always convoluted and back and forth and complex in all its nature?
I could say to you, look at Ethiopia. Or look at Lebanon. When I had some family in Lebanon, they used to talk about it. People would say it's one of the most magnificent places, and then it's conflict. So it's 2 steps forward and sometimes 3 steps back for some countries, and others 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It depends a lot on government and corruption. And while you have corrupt governments, thoughtless governments, while there are in some countries an industry, may it be the guns or the oil, that control decisions, then it's very messy because peace is very fickle there.
You're a natural communicator, and I think you've displayed that already here today, but certainly in your experience as a lawyer and as a mediator. And so when you consider truth and reconciliation committees and commissions such as what they had in South Africa, the Arusha Accords in Tanzania following the genocide in Rwanda, how important do you think to peace building and maintaining that peace is those communications and those reconciliation committees are, and talking and expressing grievances, which I said you come across a lot in mediation?
It's valuable. In fact, it's vital, because unless you follow through, there's that anger. So let me give you an example. I met a woman, she spoke at a conference. So she was speaking and this other man was speaking. The woman had only one hand. And so one of them was a Hutu, the other was a Tutsi. And they go around the world talking about peace building. She was very wealthy. The man was her gardener. So war happened, conflict happens. Conflict happened because of external colonial processes. And She was trying to escape. Her husband had already been killed. She had a baby, a daughter, and they grabbed the baby, smashed the baby, killed the daughter, and he then recognised, the gardener was on the opposite side, who she was. And he said, I don't want to kill you, but I've got to do something. So he chopped off her hand. So she was left with nothing, you can imagine, in front of her. She met him years later and forgave him. Forgave him. And they built a relationship on how to talk about forgiveness. Now, forgiveness doesn't mean there's no justice. Peace and reconciliation is a step. There needs to be justice. There needs to be provision. It's no use saying sorry with what does that sorry mean? And apologising and forgiveness are two things as well, because you need that forgiveness, and it's hard. But that doesn't mean you need to forget either. In fact, it's very dangerous if you forget. So it's a vital part of a process, or else we know in Australia when you see families from certain areas of conflict, from Europe or whatever else, that it continues generation upon generation upon generation. So without reconciliation, it will just continue.
And fester.
Yep.
Yes, and yeah, we see the festering in certain nations. Ethiopia is a great example, as you've mentioned. Several years, ago, the president won the UNESCO Peace Prize, and then the country disintegrated not long thereafter. So you can see peace as such a fragile thing that needs to be constantly maintained. You probably have examples of this, and I'm sure Ian has as well, but do you think that intervention in war and conflict disrupt the natural resolution of conflict? So when you have outside intervention into conflict areas, communities experiencing conflict, do you think that sometimes outside intervention actually disrupts what could possibly be a natural resolution?
I think a lot of time you're disempowering the people of the country. Sometimes they have to fight their own wars, for want of a better word. Sometimes, for example, in Cambodia, you wait it out for the generations and hope for change. I've just come back from Thailand. There we are, two new opposition partners talking about getting together and changing the regime. Two young people. And it was obvious speaking to the Thais. So I was there at the time of the election. And they had no alcohol from 6 p.m. Saturday to 6 p.m. Sunday. And we put on a formal function. So back to external intervention. I was against the intervention in Iraq. I believe it was illegal. That's my personal view, and I stand by it now and did at the time. And I was very vocal at the time. Again with Afghanistan, you must be kidding me. How many times? And the sad thing is, when the United States came in and removed Russia, they walked away. What do they do in Iraq? They walk away. They don't stay long enough to help and put the funds into rebuilding. The war's over, we've spent $50 billion, let's get out. And it all collapses again. So very rarely does external intervention bring lasting peace. It's not sustainable because it's not internal. It may be painful to see struggles. Now, I know Rwanda's different, and that long-term colonial impact, and we know President Clinton was criticised by peacekeepers and peace builders saying, get in there, get in there. And he was worried because, again, of the history, Vietnam,
Herzegovina,
yeah, exactly.
Croatia.
Yeah. I'd still stick with my view that it's rarely successful because it's not sustainable.
Oh, there's so many good questions here. Well, women, gender, and intersectionality in peace building. So how do all of these impacts. So when you're looking at peace building, are there examples of these processes going well or badly? So when we think about intersectionality, we think about, I know you've mentioned, being a white woman, being a foreign woman coming in. And so do you think that ethnicity, sexuality, educational status, how are these taken into account to build an impact?
For me, it was a long journey. I thought I knew everything, and they could sense the superiority attitude I had. And it was a fabulous white woman, an older woman, who took me aside and pointed her finger at me. Do you realise how you come across? And that was a big lesson, and I was so grateful she did it. What has helped is the silver hair. There is the respect of the elder, and that has helped a lot in speaking with groups. I've also become a better listener. And lawyers, I know it's crazy, but we often don't learn to listen, and we interpret too quickly. The skill of listening, questioning, and trying to understand is huge. And that space of silence, and just allowing people to tell their story. So an older woman has worked well, and even in Mongolia, status depends what you're doing. In Cambodia, it was just the silver hair and being a grandmother. In Mongolia, status was very important because we're dealing with judges. And the women, the top people were women. So they connected. So it depends. It really depends on who are you dealing with and what are you trying to do. Gender can be an advantage, a disadvantage, same with age. Ethnicity, I'm of such mixed heritage that's helped. And I mean, yes, I'm white, but I've learned over the years that I don't do the talking. It's the local community leaders that do the talking. Mm.
And positioning yourself. Oh, sorry, Kiki.
Do you think size has something to do with how tall you might be?
That's a great question. Yes, my size, I am not, well, in Cambodia, the women love it. In Vietnam, in the far north, when I was up there, they basically ignored Ian and the others, and they took me to the village and they showed, because I was the same height. And that's great. In the Western world, I stand my ground when 6'2" men start getting really close. In fact, at one time, when I was really getting these men up close, white Australian men, I did this.
Oh, how clever. I love that.
That stopped them. And once in the silence, I said, "You okay? I'm happy to continue the conversation." So a disadvantage in the Western world, but I don't give a damn. And perhaps an advantage in other countries.
Did any of the men squat down to join you? to be face to face or no?
End of conversation.
Yeah.
Which was good because it was the end of the aggression.
Yeah.
So it was stopping aggressive behaviour because it was the unexpected.
Yeah. Speaking of aggressive behaviour, peacekeeping and peace building can be dangerous work for those working in these areas, working in conflict or post-conflict zones where emotions are raw and people have suffered great loss. And so have you ever in your experience felt that you were personally in any kind of physical danger in doing your work, and how did you handle that?
I haven't, but I've been left speechless when I've seen tortured women. And I use that term speechless because some of the women and the older women had had their tongues removed from the Pol Pot regime. Eyes removed, but they were survivors. So personally, No, it's been actually situations in Australia, again, where I have felt more threatened, especially at one time when I had somebody jump on the witness box and try to strangle me. That was the only time where I was physically threatened. It is seeing those in the other countries that are those obvious physical, and I don't even see the psychological impact, the physical impact in itself. Cambodia has more amputees per head of population than any other country in the world. And more of those are women and children than men, because they work in the field or they can only go to the toilet at night. So you see it. You see it there. But I've not felt it except for that one time in Australia.
And of course, in Cambodia, you know, children often find unexploded ordnances that look like toys, and often find them, and that's how they get injured, which is just horrifying to contemplate. So you've mentioned that you haven't felt physically unsafe, but when you see what you've seen and you've spoken with you know, women and people who've experienced horrific loss and conflict and violence, how do you keep yourself emotionally and psychologically safe? Because that's a whole nother aspect to it. Working in peace building, obviously you are a witness to the horrors of the world, and how do you personally take care of your mental well-being in working in these environments and with people who've had very fragile lives?
Firstly, I belong to that organisation called Rotary, where mental health and mental wellness is part of a program. We actually run a mental health first aid. So we train people in mental health first aid. For me, it is having other people there with me. So I'm part of a team, and we debrief. When we come in, we say, right, let's have a shower, calm down, and debrief. And I've found that if we haven't, and we failed this year in debriefing after I took a group of people to the killing fields, and it was actually my granddaughter who said, you took us from here to here, and we hadn't got through, we hadn't processed what we had seen. So I have totally changed that part of the program to have a night where we do nothing, just to chat, to process.
I'm sure there's lots of questions, so I will kind of end on this and then I'll pass it over to the floor. But, you know, you've had such an extraordinary career, and obviously from politics to law to environment to litigation, arbitration and peace building. Do you have advice on current and emerging skills that people will need, and what's relevant, do you think, for people to pursue and cultivate in terms of a skill set that would enable them to be successful peace builders?
Look, one of the first things is learning to have a difficult conversation. You've all heard the term, they might call it crucial conversation or difficult conversation. Take that seriously. If it's going to be an important conversation, prepare for it. The hardest conversations with teenage kids, trust me. But it seriously is important, because what is said can't be unsaid. What is sent in a message or an email can't be unsent unless you're quick on that 1 second or 2 seconds. And the conflict and how people are destroyed by words is huge. We think physical, we think guns and those types of things. What you say and how you say it, the unintended consequences. You might be thinking you're doing the right thing, but culturally, you may be doing the exact opposite. So having difficult conversations, listening, being aware of all your hidden prejudices. They're there. And therefore, you need to ask, have I offended? Tell me what you need from me. Be open. Apologize and find out what do I call you? when this last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of work in Singapore and in training people in Rotary International. As I said, 160 countries. And I feel so sad when I might be speaking with somebody from Taiwan and I can't pronounce their name, and they'll say, "Oh, call me dentist," or "call me this," or they make up an English name because they're almost apologizing to us that we can't pronounce their name. So I've learned to say, what name would you like to be called? And I will work on that and try to remember that rather than initials. You know, like the other day, he said, "Call me GB." I said, "What would you prefer?" He said, "Well, I'm Gimbok." I said, "I'm happy to call you Gimbok." So understanding our cultural biases and working through them, and not presuming we're experts, because we're certainly not.
That's very true. And what advice would you give to somebody who's looking to enter, the world of peacebuilding? Obviously, it's very varied. There's different ways people can do peacebuilding and peacekeeping. There's lots of different roles in which that's apparent. There's your more direct, a literal peacekeeper with the UN, with the blue helmet, and obviously that's quite a specific role. But your role is so interesting in that, as you said, that grassroots peacebuilding that really builds and probably is far more sustainable in the long run as well when it comes to working with communities at that grassroots level. But what would you suggest to people who wanted to work in peacebuilding and peacekeeping beyond cultural safety, addressing our cultural biases, but do you think that pursuing law is the best option, or do you think doing a master's in peace and conflict studies, or do you think that people with a wide range of skills and backgrounds can still enter a job that has peacekeeping and peace building as a huge component?
I go with the wide range. Years ago, people would think it's either the military or the lawyers. And in Australia, to be a mediator, you had to be a lawyer. Go figure. So leader, lawyers engaged in alternate dispute resolution, 10 years ago changed its name to Resolution Institute, because we realized that psychologists can be good mediators, teachers can be, whoever, engineers, that takes a bit of work, but they realize they need the skills. So a mediation course gives you the technical skills to start with. And don't dismiss those technical skills. Then a conflict coaching course, because often within your careers, it may not be right for you to intervene, but you can coach someone else on how to intervene. So there are technical courses that give you skills, whatever your other, and then you're adding that skill to the profession you already have. And you take it from there, you meld it. So yeah, law's a great background degree. I mean, law today was what arts degrees were in the 1970s. A fabulous background degree. You don't need to practice law, but a great degree. But I'm mindful that people don't have the odd $20,000 or whatever to go and do a law degree. But mediation degrees, conflict coaching degrees, you're already professional and business women. So build by adding these extra skills. I talk about adding to my toolbox. I learn something, and that's another tool in my toolbox. And at the right time, I work out what tool I need to pull out in any given situation. It may be law. It may be I have to make a determination. It may be questioning. It may be listening. It may be assisting somebody else to come in because I'm not the right person. So academic degrees are great if we can afford them nowadays. I think we need to look at practical skills.
When it comes to particularly these conflict mediation courses, they are specialised, as you say, and you can add them on to your technical, your profession if you're a teacher or an engineer. Where would people find those courses?
Well, there's a few organisations. I do a lot of work with Resolution Institute, and they run 5-day mediation courses, and then you do a test which is basically carrying out a mock mediation. And then there's the conflict coaching course there. That's 3-4 days. I'm not sure. I did mine years ago with the military. And the difficult conversations course is 2 days. Some of these can be done by Zoom. Some of them are virtual, others are face-to-face. I think it's great to do face-to-face on mediation. And sometimes I pull them all together. So for some community groups, I will spend 2 days giving them, it's like a tasting platter of, okay, you don't have time to do 12 days of skills, but you're going in as a district governor of Rotary, or you're going into a job where you just need to understand there's better ways of doing things. That's not ideal. I mean, when we coach people in conflict coaching or train them in mediation, they're from all walks of life. The police force, the health professionals, the Department of Education, Service New South Wales. There's conflict everywhere. Academia, trust me, the conflict there, so that I would manage. It's actually, I was making more money in conflict management than in law, which is very sad. They're great courses. There's also there's a couple of other organisations. I'm just trying to think of the other one.
It's okay if you don't think of it. We can always come back to it.
There's 3 good ones. Yeah.
Well, perhaps after this I can circulate some of those. I'm going to hand it over to the floor now, because I'm sure some of you have some questions and following on from things that Jennifer's mentioned this evening. So just let me know if you have a question. I'll bring you the microphone just because we are on Zoom, so important to capture your question. Yes, Natasha.
Thanks, Vivian. Thanks, Jennifer. This has been really interesting. My question was a bit to do with if you had an example or anything like that of some of the instances of countries in post-conflict or have experienced a genocide where there are things like rape camps, forced impregnation, really how people, I guess, to summarise, move on from something like that.
I probably don't have enough experience to be able to give some guidance on that. And the term moving on, it's a tough term. I know people have this view of, okay, you should be over the grief, you should be over the horrific. It's learning to live with it. And I think when I've dealt with women who have been abused or women who have had their children killed, and that's, again, it's been in Australia, they either see that they've got a role to play in making sure it never happens again, or they feel they've got to keep the conflict going. They used to be called vexatious litigants or querulants, but those terms are no longer used, because if they don't keep the conflict going, the anger, then people might forget what's happened to them. So they live in that area of grief and anger forever, which is very destructive, but they're fearful of the vacuum if they don't. So you've got those 2 camps. And then you've got the people who look like they're living a normal life, but will never, ever talk about their past. As in, their life starts in, 2015. There was no life before.
Hi, thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Vivian, for this wonderful session. So I come from India, and like many societies, India is also predominantly patriarchal. Men are the primary decision makers, probably in any particular household. And even though women and children are vulnerable, we have to involve the men as well when it comes to probably any intervention. What has been your experience, in involving particularly those who impact, the people who live with them, and how have you made it kind of sustainable? So willingly getting them involved as well.
So just checking is how has the whole family unit, that's a long road. We've worked in Cambodia, we think we get it right, and then we don't. For example, we had these wonderful young girls being educated and looking at university, and I met with their father, and he was so excited that he'd pulled them out of school and put them in the Chinese garment factory so they could earn money now. And he was very proud of his girls, but he'd basically sold them into slavery, but he was now getting an income. So he failed there. And then I've met families who were against their daughters being educated. And I've gone back a couple of years later, and they are so proud and thankful that their daughters, that they see their daughters in another light. And it is wonderful to see the fathers where I've actually seen decisions when there's so much poverty where they've kept a daughter at school and pulled out the son. And that's what I'm seeing quite a bit in Cambodia, because sometimes you can't afford. I've also seen the opposite, but it's great to see, well, it's sad to see any child being pulled out of school, but there are choices being made. It has taken a long time in Cambodia to get the families on side, and we had to actually, for some years, provide funds back to the family for recompense for the girls not working in the fields. So you can't change things without getting the families coming along. It's not sustainable.
Mine is quick, thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I actually had a question, and as you said before about realising conflict stuff, working post-disasters and pre, sometimes the conflict in communities is really evident, especially when you work for government. But verbally, it's very clear. But I was just going to ask, do you have a way to find out, like say when you go into communities months later and are engaging with, like, sorry, this is very specific, in other situations, how you kind of can see where there is division? Like, do you have ways to sense, or in engagement activities, how you can see what division does exist? Because sometimes that's one of the biggest things, is not understanding when engagement begins and you are engaging, even choosing where the community engagement activity is held can be putting yourself on a particular side. So do you have a way to kind of start sensing when you're kind of new to a community and new to engaging with a different group?
We do, only in recent years. Can I say, I think well-meaning people have made a lot of mistakes in the past. For example, there was a German Rotary Club working in one of the countries in Africa where these men saw the girls and the women walking for kilometres to get water, walking all the way back. And these men had the engineering brain. We can fix that. We'll pipe the water into the town. Sounds great. They come back to check on how things are going, and the women are begging for them to take it away. Because, you see, that long walk was a time for the girls to learn from their mothers, and it was a time out of the eyesight of the men. The men saw them standing around the water in the village, and it ended up horrific domestic violence. So that was an example of not asking, not understanding. Yep, very. Or putting in, like in Myanmar, putting in a system that required, what fuel was it? A fuel not available in Myanmar. What a waste of a huge generator. So I see this in Fiji as well. But that was, for Rotary, we've learnt that a community assessment isn't going and talking to the leaders. It is who the leaders represent. Who else? Who else? You dig and dig and dig and expand, and it takes time. And it's at that time you set criteria measurement. So when you go back, how do you know what is achieved? So it's a process that takes some years, the committee assessment, and then going in and doing it, then reviewing it. And we've had to change partway through. When we were in Mongolia, and we were working with the judges and the Judicial Council, and I'm seeing this questioning look, and it's day 3. And they hadn't, you see, in Mongolia, you don't use English terms. They thought that mediation was reconciliation. So they thought a mediation failed if they separated. So they wouldn't let, and they didn't want their statistics to fail. So they made these people stay together. So we should have done some more language work, more understanding of what things mean. And we had to change processes. It's probably only in the last, I don't know, 8 years that we've really worked hard on going beyond the seeing a problem, fixing it and walking away, thinking all done, without measurement, without impact, without saying, now when you go back, what do you see? What has changed? And we work on that.
Thank you. Hi, Jennifer. I'm feeling very fortunate also I got to chat with you before the talk, but thank you so much. And also for Vivian for this really wonderful conversation. So as you're talking a lot about, this contextual analysis, being attuned to the needs of the actual community, and I'm not sure if this has been a buzzword or relevant for anyone else's work, but DFAT has a whole strategy around localization. So how to have a localization focus in development programming. I was just wondering kind of how you either have a framework or an approach or a way to think about the balance between how we're able to influence, particularly implementing partners and local, whether it's a civil society organization or a local implementing partner, versus where we've also leaned on past, whether it was unintended, the path that was paved with good intentions, but all of that unintended harm, especially for vulnerable people. So I'm thinking about things like, working with civil society organizations and trying to use a mix of capacity building and influence to understand how we can instill best practices around safeguarding or around JEDC or around how, again, we're making sure that we're taking into account how programs and interventions can be fully inclusive and fully aware of the needs of the community. And sometimes there is that pushback as well from the partners saying, oh, this is just, further neocolonialization, or this is further DFAT pushing their agenda, DFAT using these acronyms. And I was just wondering how you strike that balance, especially trying to be present in the community, trying to listen, but also that you yourself may have an agenda, whether it's that you may have a certain perspective, you may have certain experience that you're trying to share or trying to influence a particular conversation. So where you find that balance, because you said earlier that we don't have all the answers and we need to listen. But also I think we're in this profession because we're trying to work towards how do we get a little bit better. So just, I guess that tension of that balance, how you see it.
Again, it's been a journey. 15 years ago, you would have the Romeos go in, build a school, put a plaque on it and walk away and pat themselves on the back. Now it's so different. Firstly, as volunteers, we talk about in Rotary time, talent and treasure. Some people have time and like to do things, but are they the right person? Some people have fabulous talent, and if they can be doctors, dentists, engineers, can they give us a couple of weeks to guide us? And others have got the money. What we have in Rotary is what's called Rotary Action Groups, and they're experienced, skilled people. And for example, in water and sanitation, WASH projects, we have some of the best minds in the world. So before I even think of a toilet or drilling a well or anything like that, I get the local engineers, and if they're not sure, we have these global experts that will say, we're in Cambodia, what are you doing? This is what's needed. These are the great people over there. So we partner. when we talk about as volunteers, we don't always do the work because we don't have the skills. And also we have people coming from the outside in. So we partner with local Rotarians, and we partner with local professionals or local engineers. And also we look at who else is working in that space and what is their reputation in that space, in those communities. And choosing your partners is really important because it impacts on your reputation and their reputation. So we really do look at finding the right people, the right skills. And when it comes to politics, we try to avoid it. We're a non-political, non-religious organisation. And we have to stay that way. So sometimes we won't do projects if it's going to be politicised. So we pulled out of Bangladesh for some years because of politicalisation. But the good news is, despite what's happening in Myanmar, we've been allowed in there all the time, so long as we work on the ground. So there's that fine line on getting the right partners, the right skills, and knowing when we just don't have the capacity or we're not the right people to be doing it. We work with DFAT. Well, we usually ask for money, actually, as in there's sometimes, I know DFAT focuses on certain areas, certain geographical areas, certain countries. And we also use DFAT as to finding out. So when I went to Nepal, when I went to Mongolia, that was one of the early things I did, was to meet with Australia's representatives to get that background of, can you give us some background of your perspective, Australia's perspective, what's happening there? I probably didn't answer your question, so I do apologise.
Any other questions? My question was also very similar, because you mentioned before that you were very steadfastly against intervention, but then there is, Vivian asked an incredible question about responsibility to protect. So very similar, how do you strike the balance, knowing when to acknowledge that there is a responsibility to protect for some populations whilst understanding that intervention is not sustainable?
We have, until probably about 10 years ago, Rotarians always thought we were not into the disaster aid. We would come in, we would say we come in once the disaster's off the front page, because we're in that long term when people stop giving money, where we work for years and years and years on the ground. We found that was all very well, but there was a need. So, for example, Rotary is known for providing shelter box. So Red Cross International uses the shelter boxes because Red Cross was of the view that they're good at other things, so not providing shelter. And even with shelter, we've realised that we have to do it differently. We used to provide a box with what we thought everything was needed, until we realised that might suit a hot climate, but not a cold climate. Or they didn't need water, they needed water filtration or whatever else. So we've learnt that there are times we go in for disaster, but we only have specialised people that go in, trained people that go in, and only, once again, working with other international organisations rather than everybody rushing in and doing things. That's been over the years, finding what space is appropriate for us to be involved in and when. And then it continues for the years after.
Have any other final? Oh, yes, Sean?
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you, Jen, for coming and meeting us, even if it's the last question. It's a very general one, and it's more about just your career in the industry and things that you've gathered. Where do you find that, what do you think is the #1 reason that women in peacebuilding and development are losing their momentum and are losing their enthusiasm? Maybe they're getting sent to some positions over others. Maybe they're thinking that they're going to go overseas and experience this amazing new, transformational experience, and then they completely lose their steam. They don't want to work in the industry anymore, either because they recognize that there's some form of neocolonialism here, or because they're getting underutilized, or because they're getting, taken advantage of or abused in these positions. Where do you think women are actually getting stuck and what's the worst reasons that you've experienced or the stories you've collected where they've just gotten themselves out of the industry because of it? And on the less depressing side, where do you think women are actually thriving the most in this industry?
The first part of your question, that's got such a long history. You look at women in the war zones as journalists. You look at women in the First World War who wanted to go out as nurses or doctors. It's improved. It's improved in the military. Certainly there where you have women on the front line, but you've always had women on the front line, just not acknowledged. I mean, let's face it, the Eureka Stockade, you know, they idolize these men. They don't talk about the women that were killed there. You know, their names weren't even mentioned until a book was written on it, an academic book about 7 or 8 years ago. So I think one that just historically, I know it's trite, but it's history, his story. I think women have to start writing the story and keeping on writing, be it social media. If we're just pissed off and walk away, well, what difference, you know, the next generation and the generation after, I don't know. I mean, I'd love to say when is it going to end, but then, you know, the women in the 60s, the 1970s, 1980s, I'm very disappointed that we are still having these conversations. I simply thought that my daughters wouldn't have to. The good news, you know, they're in some areas, for example, in Rotary, in Thailand, 40% of the leaders are women in Rotary. Go figure. In Australia, it's 28%. In Britain, it's pretty mediocre. It is, again, the stale, white, privileged male. In the Philippines, lots of women. Timor-Leste? Yep. So it is, to some extent, that British colonialism that's even keeping, you know, women down in Australia, New Zealand. I mean, look at how our women leaders are still, it's still allowed. And it's fed by the commercial media. I mean, I don't listen to commercial media anymore. I'm not interested. I don't want to get angry. I want to keep on doing good.
Working in the humanitarian development and now peacebuilding area for more than 20 years, I am prouder than ever to be able to say that if I were starting this work again, I would start in the same area. And I'm teaching at the university now. I'm teaching the Masters of Peace and Conflict Studies, and I'm meeting a lot of young women students who want to enter this field. And I tell them the stories that we've had, some good, some bad, but it's not certainly an area where you would be wanting to feel that women do not have an extremely central, essential role. In fact, I say it's women leading on peace. That's my course. So it's something to say that after being through this in this field, and I started in Sudan, 1980s, and during the 90s I was in Rwanda during the genocide. I was in Bosnia dealing with the rape in war. Then I went to Kosovo. Then I went some time, all during that time, Thai-Burma border. And 5 years after 2001, 9/11, I spent 5 years in Afghanistan. All these countries have all shown to me that women are definitely leading on peace. And we have to keep maintaining that role because essentially I think if we're not going to be there, we're literally, I think, denying the fact that, as what Jennifer said, peace is a shared responsibility. It's not up to one of us, it's all of us. And if we're going to leave half the population of the planet out of peace, we will never achieve peace. So we need to make sure that it's a shared responsibility. And that English word responsibility, it's wonderful. Ability to respond.
I like that. Now, Patricia is with the Institute of Economics and Peace. And if you're interested with courses, fabulous courses online with the Institute, with IEP. Trust me, it just opens up that big picture of positive peace and getting that deep understanding. They've got a great partner, they're former partners with Rotary International now for some years, and it's a fabulous partnership that has built tremendous skills within our peace builders within Rotary.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And I have to say, just on with the work we do in Rotary, the men used to do a bit of work, but when women got into Rotary, that's when you saw action. That's when you saw work on the ground, less talk and more action.
I might just borrow that if I can, just because mine's going to walk about. Wow. Well, I think we can continue this conversation over some canapes and some drinks. But I just would like to thank Jennifer for her time and her insights, and thank you all for your questions and your insights that I hope to continue the conversation with. We would like to show our appreciation to Jennifer with a small gift, a Women in Aid and Development mug, which will ensure that you have the best looking coffee in your home office, although you are rarely at home. You are always gallivanting around the world as you do, meeting people and talking to people and communicating with people and connecting people, which you do so well. We hope to see you at hopefully some future gatherings if you're in the country. But I'd also like to thank the rest of the Women in Aid and Development Leadership Group who've supported this event this evening. Also like to thank Natasha for putting together some of the questions. Thank you so much, they were fantastic. And thank you, Chris, our chair, our fearless leader of Women in Aid and Development, who puts in so much time, effort, love, and just real drive to put these events together, to find speakers, to bring us all together this evening as well, and to connect us all. So I will hopefully all of you will remain connected, and we'll see you at many more events to come. Please do connect with us online if you haven't already. Follow us on our social media channels, connect with us on LinkedIn, not just the Women in Aid and Development group, but also us as individuals. And obviously our Facebook and other socials, as I mentioned. You'll also be on our mailing list if you aren't already to come to future events. I believe we've got one coming up mid to late July, 25th of July, I believe, but you'll obviously get an email notifying you of the date and time. That's the end of this evening's session. We do have actually just a little activity that you might want to do over some drinks. We'd like to get some of your thoughts on this evening's session and think about some of your key takeaways and also things that you'd like to see next. So different topics, different speakers, different areas that we'd like to touch upon. So please stay and enjoy, socialise a bit more with us. There's some fantastic food we should definitely make use of. It's certainly dinner time. And just one final round of applause for Jennifer Scott. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
I forgot to say that Rotary International, through our foundation, provides scholarships for masters and diploma courses in peace in various universities around the world, in Britain, United States, Japan. Yes, we have one in Queensland, but you've got to go overseas. And we've just received a $30 million grant to create one in Turkey, and we're building one in, it's not Kenya, capital of Kenya? No, it's Nairobi. It is Nairobi. So if you're interested, and you know, Makerere. Oh, it is, damn. Thank you. Thank you. I kept on getting it wrong because I know the shortlist. And being a peace builder, just because your career is another line, don't think you're not peace builders. We had a clown who went to Chulalongkorn University in Thailand, and her role was working with refugee children. And it would sometimes take weeks for them to lift their head and learn how to smile and laugh again. So peace building comes in many shapes and forms. You are peace builders if you choose to be.